Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. But welcome everyone, and thank you for joining RMI today for an insider's look at what goes on at Climate Week in New York every year. My name is Audrey M., and I'm a Senior Development Officer here at RMI. And over the next hour, we'll do a deep dive into Climate Week through a facilitated discussion with a couple of our senior program leaders at RMI. John is going to facilitate a 15-minute discussion with our panelists, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from our audience. Please submit your questions throughout the course of the webinar in the Q&A tab at the bottom far right of your Zoom bar at the bottom where it says Q&A. If you can submit your questions there, we will be sure to get them to our panelists. And without further ado, it is now my great pleasure to introduce John Creyts to everyone. John is the Managing Director of Programs at RMI, and where he co-leads overall program activity and is responsible for RMI Ventures, which is a global collaboration focused on accelerating early stage climate solutions. John brings over 25 years of experience in strategy, operations, and design experience to resource issues at the interface of markets and technology. John helped establish our China program back in 2013. He is also a member of our executive council, where he helps guide the overall direction of the Institute. Prior to joining RMI, John was a partner at McKinsey & Company, where he actually helped found McKinsey's sustainability practice and was a member of the global energy practice there as well. So welcome, John. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for facilitating the conversation today. And maybe I will go ahead and kick things off and start with a question for you. Why does RMI even have a presence at Climate Week, and why is Climate Week important to us?
Thanks, Audrey. I'm delighted to join today, and first off, would just like to extend a hearty welcome to all our viewers, and most especially our donors, without whose support we wouldn't be able to do the work we do. Before I jump into your question, let me just begin by saying that 2021 has already been a year of climate consequence. Right, July was our hottest month in recorded history, and likely the hottest that humans have ever seen since we arrived on the planet. Due to climatic changes, virtually all major economies have experienced an increase in weather-induced catastrophes, from floods and fires to hurricanes and monsoon damage to debilitating heat waves. No region of the world has been left unscathed. And predictably, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an assembly of the world's leading scientists on climate, issued a report several weeks ago that indicated the prospects of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees is rapidly fleeting right now. And they issued a code red alert for the planet. So against this backdrop, this year's Climate Week carries special significance because it launches the run-up to COP26, which is a moment in November when our global leaders can step forward to commit to more ambitious goals to address the climate crisis underway. Climate Week itself it's a civil society convening. So you'll hear lots of announcements from companies and cities and other non-state actors. It's really set up to be that convening as an alternative to government processes. But it does run alongside the UN General Assembly. So you'll also hear news from initial country positionings on their plans regarding any changes to their nationally determined contributions to reducing greenhouse gases that will ultimately be formalized in COP26. So there's a progression between these two events that's very important. And over the next roughly 8 weeks, you'll see a lot of activity build and gain momentum here. For RMI, Climate Week is an important event because it's the direct convening of the stakeholders and collaboration partners that we work with. We're focused on using markets and leveraging civil society collaborations to secure a clean, prosperous, and zero carbon future for all. For those who haven't checked in with us lately, you saw in the intro some of the elements of our strategy, but it's really built around doing 2 things in 5 places. First, we focus on deep decarbonization of 4 energy-intensive sectors, including the built environment, including mobility, heavy industry, and the power grid. Second, we build globally scalable market catalysts that focus on opportunities like climate intelligence, breakthrough technology deployment, climate finance, policy, and leadership training to ensure we can move the $3 to $5 trillion per year that's required to retool the world's economy and transition us to a climate-aligned pathway. And we deploy these capabilities in critical geographies where RMI can contribute distinctively, including China, India, and the United States, but also the global South with a special focus on Asia, Africa, and island economies, and cities because the impact of rapid urbanization on our long-term emissions footprint is sizable. It's an ambitious portfolio of activity, but we believe in each area there are ways for RMI to contribute uniquely and secure the 1.5 degree future that's critical for our planet. So with all this as backdrop, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists and my colleagues who will join us in conversation today. First up, we have Rushad Nanavatty, who is Managing Director of our Urban Transformation Program, which focuses on helping cities around the world simultaneously reduce emissions, enhance urban livability, increase resilience, and advance social equity. Rushad also helped establish and lead the Global Cooling Prize, a global innovation competition to develop climate-friendly residential cooling solutions. Prior to RMI, Rushad served as the founding COO of WeGen Energy, a startup developing off-grid energy solutions and virtual power plants in the Philippines and Vietnam, utilizing a mix of distributed solar and battery energy storage. Cate Hight is our second panelist. She's a principal in our Climate Aligned Industries program, as well as the Chief Operating Officer for the Mission Possible Partnership, which is an alliance of climate leaders focused on supercharging efforts to decarbonize some of the world's highest emitting industries in the next 10 years. Prior to joining RMI, Cate spent 10 years in the US Environmental Protection Agency, where she led the agency's work on carbon market development, played lead roles in the development of key greenhouse gas regulations, and co-authored the annual US inventory of GHG emissions and sinks. And our third panelist is Laetitia Marez, who I'm just delighted to welcome. She's a senior principal with our Global South program, leading RMI's Climate Finance Access Network that aims to unlock critical climate finance for the most vulnerable developing countries, which include island nations and least developed countries. Laetitia brings expertise in climate diplomacy, international climate finance architecture, assisting developing countries in national climate action plans, as well as private sector engagement and mobilization. Prior to RMI, Laetitia led the work of climate analytics on international climate finance, capacity building and implementation strategies in the Caribbean, Pacific Small Island developing states, and West Africa. Let me just welcome all three of you to the discussion. And why don't we just kick off with a question for the entire panel, which is, Climate Week does unofficially launch this road to COP in November. And as we think about the progression of things, why is Climate Week important for you and your team? And in particular, what are the commitments or the outcomes that you are on the lookout for as you think about, kind of the pathway to COP26? Rushad, do you want to kick us off here?
Sure, John. Thank you. So it is important, but I'll also just go ahead and say it feels a little bit absurd. We're in the middle of a crisis, and we shouldn't need a special sort of corporate-sponsored week to recognize it and instigate action. When your community is threatened by wildfire, you don't hold a wildfire prevention week. You just do everything you can possibly do to protect your homes and your people. So the fact that we have a climate week at all, still have the COP, means in some ways that the decarbonization imperative isn't yet a central everyday part of how we do business and run society. So now that I've gotten that off my chest, the thing that I'm most excited about is the launch of Urban Shift, which is an initiative led by the UN Environment Program that aims to support cities in the Global South, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, in adopting integrated climate-friendly approaches to urban development. And I'm excited about it for a couple of reasons. One, it's squarely focused on implementation and technical support. We've had lots and lots of cities make big commitments, draft climate action plans, but only a really, really small proportion on track to actually meet their goals. About 1 in 10 in the US, according to research by Brookings. And RMI set up its cities program to address that exact problem, that gap between implementation and action, between planning and project implementation. We focus really, really heavily on delivering practical nuts and bolts technical assistance at scale. And it's great to see Urban Shift articulate essentially the same logic. Two, it's focused on integrated approaches, which is really, really well aligned with the classic RMI whole systems logic, which is about exploiting the efficiency potential that exists not just within systems, but between systems. So in the context of rapidly growing cities in the global south, where a massive proportion of our 2030 infrastructure has yet to be built, if you design buildings, transportation systems, power systems, natural systems, entire neighborhoods to work together, you can drive much, much deeper decarbonization, much more cheaply than designing those systems in isolation. And three, I'm excited about the organizations involved. One of our biggest threats and human concerns right now is extreme heat and how we deal with it. You talked about this in your intro. We're working really closely with UNEP to help cities develop comprehensive strategies for sustainable urban cooling. WRI is our closest partner on the Bloomberg-sponsored American Cities Climate Challenge. Through that program, we've helped over 150 cities with renewable energy procurement and building decarbonization here in the US. And so I'm really, really excited about potentially expanding those partnerships to Asia and Africa.
Terrific, Rushad. And certainly we can't afford to just compartmentalize climate into 1 week, but it brings focus, right? And we have 2,000 companies now that have committed to climate aligned targets. And this gives a bit of a forum and an opportunity for joint announcements and collaboration. Cate, I know you've been working really heavily on the industry front. What are you looking for, and why is Climate Week important to your team?
Yeah, thanks, John. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. So I think that this past year has really represented a sea change in the way that people talk about corporate action on climate. And I think some of this has been precipitated by news coming out from science, but I think a lot of it is precipitated by this sort of awakening that the corporate community is experiencing, that now is the time to act. You know, I work on a thing called the Mission Possible Partnership, which is focusing on the hardest to abate sectors: steel, cement, all these big things that comprise our economy today. And until really a year ago, these sectors have always been sort of the third rail of the climate conversation. Oh, that's too hard. Oh, they're globally distributed. Oh, what about trade barriers? How's this going to work, right? But now there's a critical mass of companies who are saying, hey, look, we see a business opportunity in this. We see a moral imperative to act. And we're also seeing the same sort of thing transpire in the energy inputs community with all the activism around the oil and gas companies and natural gas as an input. We're seeing this transpire in the financial community with shareholders who are throwing up their hands and saying, look, if you don't get your act together and iron out your portfolio, we're not going to travel with you any longer. And we are seeing this in some governments who are understanding that now is the time to really enter into deep dialogue with corporations on the change that needs to happen. So I'm super inspired by Climate Week and also leading up to the UN conference coming up later this fall, because I really think that this is going to be the year for corporate action, and we're going to see a number of commitments come out of corporates. But also our role as civil society is to make sure that these commitments aren't just going out, but we have the ability to track those commitments and to ensure that they're actually delivering on them. So that's what I'm excited about, John.
Awesome. Thanks, Cate. And, you know, as we shift, Laetitia, you kind of straddle a bit between the global finance and the North-South divide that's present right now in the debate. And the discussion around how exactly to address climate. What specifically are you looking for in Climate Week?
Well, and to start off, of course, my perspective, having been in the trenches of the negotiation for so many years, I do think it's a very important moment. Not only because it brings the best from civil society, the boldest ideas, the blue sky thinking, it brings a lot of energy. And I think after a year of pause on the negotiations and on so many activities on climate change, it's really important to regain momentum. The other important part, I think, is that at Climate Week, in conjunction with UN General Assembly, you get the Global South to express needs, frustrations, hope, and ambition. And it's really important for RMI in particular to be present and to help setting the bar for COP26. For CFAN, the Climate Finance Excellence Network, climate justice is really at the core of what we do. And it is to ensure that the most vulnerable get their fair share of climate finance and get that access facilitated. So what we are expecting from Climate Week and from the UN General Assembly is to rebuild the trust between the global north and the global south. And this is through announcement of on climate finance. We all have heard about the 100 billion. We know that we fell short of reaching the 100 billion. The OECD released a report last week saying we are just at 80. 20 billion may seem not so much. It's a drip in the ocean when you know trillions of dollars, million dollars will have to be invested to solve climate change. But it represents twice the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. For the global south, it is considerable. So rebuilding the trust through announcement, and some already came through. We had the European Union, we had President Biden today, so I'm very optimistic and excited. We will see here at Climate Week and at the UN General Assembly the position of the different blocs. And it will give the opportunity to the world leaders to show leadership and try to fix contentious issues before the COP and build alliances, which is exactly what we need to address climate change.
Awesome. And it is encouraging to see that forward progress on bringing the global north and the global south together in advance of the COP here, with hopes that we can really unify against this most pressing challenge. It is a big challenge, right? And I heard lots of optimism and eagerness for, kind of different things you're looking for. But as I mentioned in my opening, a few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report that says we're not on track for 1.5 degrees, and we need rapid transformation in this decade, making it very clear that we need to deploy climate solutions now. In that context, can each of you talk about why you remain hopeful, in particular, in our solutions to ensure a path to 1.5 degrees in this decade? And maybe to change up the order here, Cate, if you wouldn't mind kind of leading us off, that'd be great.
Sure, of course. So I'm inspired because the solutions exist in many cases. It's just a matter of scaling them in the way that they need to be scaled so that we can make the impact during the time frame we want to make the impact. So, I worked with the oil and gas industry for many, many years, both at EPA and at RMI. And working with this industry, yes, you see the incentives misaligned for how the industry is trending, but at the same time, you see a lot of brilliant people who have invented technologies that we rely on today for some of our most forward-leaning things. So for example, geothermal energy. You know what technology they use for geothermal energy? A lot of the technology that was developed by oil and gas companies. So I think something that is really encouraging to me is that we have innovative brains out there in a number of these industrial sectors who are making real advances, and we have new fuels coming online, biofuels, we have green hydrogen coming online, we have natural gas with methane emissions control, which is going to be part of the solution, which are available today. So what our task is now is to make sure that we're aligning the incentives appropriately and that we're really engaging this flywheel of stakeholders that needs to make this industrial transformation possible. Industry is not going to do this on their own. This is going to take pressure from the financial stakeholders. It's going to take support from governments. And most importantly, it's going to take demand from people like us and from big companies like Volvo that procure green steel to make sure that we're setting up those incentives so the market can drive the change in the way that it really needs to move.
Yeah, it's this idea of ambition loops where we can align industry trajectory with finance, with customers, and ultimately with policy that allows us to get in a virtuous cycle of rapid response to the climate challenge. Laetitia, on your side, where do you find hope, right, in the solutions that are coming forward here right now?
Well, I think first of all, I think the science has always been a really important component for the international negotiation. Each time the IPCC released a landmark report such as this one, we saw a breakthrough. So I'm optimistic that not only the political leaders, but also the industry leaders will take this blinking code red very seriously. I think also one of the critical message from the IPCC report is that indeed we have a decade to make the changes that we need. So there's no more time for picking the low-hanging fruits. We need to leapfrog. And I think that's what needs to be in everybody's mind now. We need bold solutions, both in the North and in the South. I think the IPCC report gives us also our marching order when it comes to supporting the Global South for building its resilience to climate change. It is now very clear from that report that whatever we do now, we are going to see worsening impacts of climate change in the next decades. And therefore, there needs to be, again, a commitment from the international community to support the Global South and in particular vulnerable countries to adapt to climate change. So again, COP26, ambition is very important, but needs to be a solidarity moment as well. And I think with this backing, there's no more questions, right? There's no more debate. So now action on both sides, adaptation and mitigation is really what needs to be done.
Terrific. Thank you, Laetitia. And Rushad, from the urban development perspective, where are you finding hope in the solutions being deployed?
So three reasons. One, technical, the other political, and the third social. So the technical reason, you referred to one visual, the ambition loop. I'll refer to another. It's based on the logic of the S-curve. The energy transition will not follow a linear path. It is not following a linear path. Clean tech adoption happens gradually and then suddenly, to paraphrase Hemingway. Like the forecasts from the International Energy Agency are the classic case in point. In May of this year, it revised its forecast for global wind and solar adoption by 40% compared to the figures it published just 1 year before, by 25% compared to its numbers from just 6 months earlier. So not revisions of 4% and 2%, revisions of 40% and 25%. If the IEA was a Wall Street analyst, it would have packed up its belongings in a cardboard box and it would be walking out the door right now. So human beings routinely underestimate the pace at which new, better technologies are adopted, going back all the way to when we were still using whale oil and the horse and buggy, going all the way back to the printing press. That doesn't give us room for complacency. We still need to move those curves, forward, but it does give us room to hope. On politics, the Overton window, the window of what is politically feasible, has clearly shifted. The clean electricity performance plan that's being debated in Congress right now is a really, really solid plan. And I remember being at policy roundtables in DC 18 months ago when people were still talking about gas as a quote unquote bridge to a clean energy future, about issuing credits for gas-fired generation. I'm really hoping that Joe Manchin doesn't screw this up. But the current version of that clean electricity plan takes that option, which would have been a really dumb option, effectively off the table. On the social reason, I see this in the people who are committing to making climate action and the energy transition the focus of their careers. I see it, feel it most acutely, obviously, when I look at the incredible talent we have at RMI and on my own team. But I also see it in government, in the private sector, in our partner organizations. 10 or 20 years ago, the best and brightest all wanted to go to Silicon Valley and work for Google or Wall Street and work for Goldman Sachs. And now they want to solve climate change. And it's driven by young people, but it's not limited to them. We see so many incredibly accomplished, seasoned professionals having their road to Damascus moment, switching tracks, deciding to dedicate the rest of their careers to this. And, a cynic would say that's happening all 30 years too late. Maybe the IPCC would say the same thing. But it's a hell of a lot better than it not happening at all.
Thanks, Rushad. Well, let's talk a little bit about this exodus of talent, or the arrival of talent in the climate space, and in particular, some of the Wall Street bankers that are now shifting and thinking about climate finance and how that's accessed. Laetitia, this year at COP, countries are going to be submitting their updated national climate plans for the first time, right? There's a 5-year ratchet cycle that's on, and this is the first re-upping that's going to happen. What role does finance, and more specifically, access to finance, play in accelerating climate solutions in developing economies? And why is access to finance so key in helping countries in the global South meet their commitments?
Mm-hmm. So we already talked about the building trust. Our building trust through commitment of adequate finance is important. But I think we also forget sometimes that finance is equally what we should divest from and what we should invest in. And also we need to remember what is possible for the COP to do. The COP is a political moment. So the COP can send political signals to the industry, to the private sector, but the COP cannot decide on many of these issues. What the COP can say, what the political leaders can say, is that climate finance will continue to be scaled up, will be more accessible, and that there will be a particular focus on specific sectors. And to do so, countries need to also, in those climate plans that you mentioned, there needs to be more specific about what they will do. And something that many people don't know is when the global South, the countries in developing countries submit their national determined contribution, they specify the target and which percentage of the target is conditional to finance, to accessing international finance. So if there's no finance, sometimes the full target is not going to be reached. So access is really critical, not only for emerging economies, it's also critical for those vulnerable countries that I keep talking about, because they don't just want to survive, they want to thrive. And what they can, through climate finance, is basically to converge their big agendas that are reduce their vulnerability to climate change and set their track on sustainable development. Maybe a last point is that at the COP, we are expecting this year that the announcement that are going to be made not only bridge that gap for the 100 billion and restore the trust, but also the global leaders are going to discuss a new financial goal for 2025. So they will start a process to defining a new number and the structure of that commitment. It could be divided between adaptation and mitigation. It could be divided by sector. It could be divided between public and private finance. So all the stakeholders will need to be at the table to make this negotiation a success.
Awesome. And it's so encouraging to hear the redoubling of the effort there, specifically around issues like adaptation and resilience. And Rushad, I know cities are kind of on the front line when it comes to resilience here. The effects of climate change are felt by everybody, from what's happened in Texas, from deep freeze to hurricanes, Louisiana, New York. We've seen it in the United States here across the board, and globally. If you looked at satellite images of the world, we had whole portions of the planet that were on fire simultaneously here this year. What do you think about the city role and the community role? How can and should cities and communities plan for a resilient future? What does resiliency look like on the ground in a city like New York, where Climate Week is convening?
So the first thing I'd emphasize is that not all of any given city's residents are equally vulnerable. So wherever you look, it's our lowest income, most historically disadvantaged communities that are hurt the most, the world over. Hurt the most by the urban heat island effect because of, in the US context, historical underinvestment in parks and green space in those neighborhoods, living in less efficient, less healthy housing, because of unfair lending practices and discriminatory housing policies, dealing with higher transportation costs, fire risk, water stress, you name it, because of exclusionary zoning in this country that forces people to live far from where they work, sometimes on the wildland-urban interface or in other sensitive areas. So when you're talking about resilience, you're not just talking about implementing technical solutions. you need to recognize and address a whole range of systemic inequities. And you need to focus that work on the neighborhoods and communities at greatest risk. The second point that I make is that the technical solutions are often the same, whether you're solving for resilience or you're solving for decarbonization. So our lowest cost pathway to deep decarbonization of the power sector involves a boatload of distributed energy resources, rooftop solar, energy storage, EVs, which are essentially batteries on wheels, demand side flexibility. And these same distributed energy resources help you keep the lights on and your home at a survivable temperature when there's a grid failure. A weatherized home means lower energy consumption and emissions. It also means more protection, more hours of safety when the storm hits or when the lights go out. Green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, they help manage stormwater and mitigate flooding, but they also reduce the need for concrete and steel infrastructure and all of the embodied carbon and energy that goes with it. So by cooling a city naturally, they reduce building energy loads and emissions from the power sector. So again, resilience and decarbonization. Compact mixed-use development in an urban context means that fewer people are forced to live in vulnerable locations. It also means less car travel, more efficient use of infrastructure. All of these things are things that we're working on with cities around the world. And in the US, most notably, you mentioned Texas earlier, John, with a group of about 20 cities in Texas, a state that's exposed to both the greatest frequency and the greatest range of climate risks. At RMI, we talk about focusing on outcomes, not motives. If you simply do what makes sense, you don't have to agree on why it's important. It doesn't matter whether you care most about resilience, decarbonization, or public health and equity. The answer is essentially the same: getting away from a sprawling, resource-intensive, fossil fuel-based system as fast as we possibly can.
Terrific, Rushad. This focus on outcomes and actually moving from commitment to action is certainly, kind of at the front of mind here around Climate Week. And Cate, I know there have been lots of announcements by corporations. What are the commitments that RMI is focused on from industry leaders this week and heading into COP in November? What is it going to take to ensure that these commitments are realized, and how are you approaching that?
Sure. So with the Mission Possible partnership, we're focusing on really moving forward in 3 sectors that have a lot of ambition right now. So these are shipping, aviation, and steel. And we expect that in the weeks to come, so there is some activity around that this week. In fact, the co-executive director of Mission Possible Partnership, Faustine, is speaking right now on what it's taking to decarbonize the steel industry. But I think what we're seeing from these companies is a commitment to recycle more materials, use different sources of energy, and retool their processes. One of the reasons why it is so important at this point in time to make sure that we're bringing key stakeholders like finance, governments, and consumers into the conversation is that making an investment, and for example, a steel plant, is a very long-term investment. So the sorts of commitments that we're looking for this week and moving forward are commitments that new investment is going to be a better type of investment and that will be enabled by the supportive community of stakeholders around it. So I'm very much looking forward to the green steel community coming forward with tons of green steel that they can produce. I'm looking forward to those that procure a lot of that green steel, which range from governments to automakers, putting in offtake agreements that they're actually going to focus on procuring that steel. I'm looking forward to commitments from banks who are saying that we are going to invest in companies that are looking to produce things in a different way. And I'm really looking, and this is more toward the COP conversation, right? Really looking to governments to start internalizing some of what is possible from companies and embedding that in policy and making sure that the conditions are there for companies to begin to make these transitions, given that they're operating across borders.
Thanks, Cate. And there's one thing that I certainly think is a huge shift and change right now, which is the shift in not just focusing on CO2, but also methane, right? And the importance of that. Is there anything you'd want to say on that front here before we shift to questions from the audience? And please do send us your questions. We have a few queued up. We'd love to engage you all with the panel here.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's a very timely question. The Biden administration is really doubling down on its focus on methane, which is very encouraging because at the tail end of my time at the US EPA, we were just starting to roll out the conversation on this. So methane is a hugely important climate pollutant. Of course, a lot of it is manufactured. It is what natural gas is. Natural gas is methane. A lot of it leaks out in the processing and the production of that. But methane also comes from a number of other sources that we rely on every day: landfills, wastewater treatment, agricultural operations. So really getting a handle on where these emissions are coming from and implementing technologies to abate them is really top of mind. And I think, John, this is where I'll throw it back to you to talk a little bit perhaps about Climate Trace and how we're partnering with organizations to make sure that we really have a good sense of where not only CO2 emissions are coming from, but some of the even more powerful pollutants like methane.
Yeah, no, and it's very timely this week. Alongside Al Gore and about a dozen other nonprofits, RMI announced and launched the beta version of Climate Trace, which is a global consortium to use sensing and real-time information to get a picture of what exactly our global emissions are in real time, over time, right? I think the first version here allows us to get country level emissions within a year. We're going to use satellite and flyover data and other elements to try and get that within 6 hours so that we can start to respond in real time to where emissions are and put the right incentives in the market and drive global change here, using industry as the primary motivator and actor, right? And then following through with policy to support and underline that. So we do have a few questions that have been accumulating here. The first one is for you, Rushad, right? And it's about how our programs integrate decarbonization work with justice at the present moment. In particular, a recent report by Harlem-based We Act for the Environment for Environmental Justice showed the vast difference in extreme heat impacts on residents of communities of color. How are you and your team thinking about this whole issue of equity? I know you teased a little bit of that out, but helpful to go in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I'll maybe provide an answer on the general approach and then offer a perspective on the heat question in particular. So one, we enter this space with humility, recognizing that we don't directly represent the interests of the communities that are most affected. That leads us to, as a matter of priority, programmatic priority, working very closely with frontline community-based organizations to not just sort of consult with them, but to actively co-create solutions with them. And that's exactly what we're doing with that Texas-based work that I mentioned earlier. That extends to actively sort of finding the resources to support their work, channeling those resources to them so that they're being paid, being compensated for the time and insights that they deliver. So that's kind of the procedural equity component of that. The second thing that we do as a program is try to apply the consistent lens that in any community-facing work that we do, that the benefits disproportionately accrue to low-income groups and historically disadvantaged communities. And heat is, as I don't know who the question came from, is kind of the classic example of this. So we see these disproportionate burdens with respect to heat because of historical patterns of underinvestment and housing policy. And so we know that simple asset replacement, replacing old crappy air conditioners with better, higher performing ones, can't be the entirety of the solution. It's really, really important to think about passive solutions that apply at the urban scale. Think about, for example, the distribution of green space in a city, which is a key area of focus for us right now. And think about initiatives like resilience hubs, where communities can gather in the event of, say, a compounded grid failure along with a heat wave that can serve not only as emergency facilities in those communities, but also as centers for community revitalization. So hopefully that offers some perspectives or answers.
Thank you, Rushad. Cate, I have a couple questions here in the audience, and I'm going to group together for you that relate to the oil and gas industry in particular. And one is about the role of tax on fossil fuel companies to meet the costs of climate change. What's their responsibility, given the catastrophe is largely of their making, and the source of their excess profits? So any comments on that front? But also a question from Denny McGinn. And Denny, we're delighted you've joined us here today on how can we make it more difficult for oil and gas companies to greenwash, right? Especially in the transition here where what they're selling likely should be staying in the ground, right? When we think about our overall carbon budget and ability to manage the transition here. Your thoughts and comments on both of these?
Sure. So on the tax question, so I mean, I've worked in market instruments for a really long time. In my view, everything that we do in climate policy is trying to apply a carbon price in some way, right? If you really kind of get it down to brass tacks, everything is sort of a distorted carbon price, some of the things that we're doing. So a tax is an example of putting a price on carbon that is sort of a penalty tax. The other side of that is an incentive-based tax, which would be an extra win, right? Which is something that we've pursued at RMI through our MIQ program, which differentiates gas based on how much it's leaking methane. So the tax question is a political one, and it really depends on the appetite of the politicians to activate on that. I think, however, that we do have a lot of opportunities on the market-based instrument side to put out voluntary incentives that then can be taken up by policymakers to set forward a constructive dialogue to make sure that we're helping those who can rise to the top continue to rise to the top. On the greenwashing piece, this is intimately tied to companies being able to demonstrate that they are making progress on things like the MIQ differentiated gas standard. The only way we can believe companies is if we have transparent access to data that is accounting for where their emissions are coming from and where their product is moving. This is an area that RMI is very active in our climate intelligence program, and sort of related to the climate trace work that John talked about earlier. But we have new digital tools available to us that enable us to actually track emissions through the supply chain, from where a product originates to where it's embedded in a product when it's actually sold to the final consumer. And this is the area that I'm frankly the most excited about in sort of the intersection of corporates and climate over the next probably decade, is I think we're going to see an incredible proliferation and penetration of technology that gives us the transparency we need, that we can then help make differentiated products like MIQ help companies rise to the top of their game.
Great, thanks, Cate. I think there's an equivalent for both of these last questions. There's a global South perspective, right? When we think about the communities that are most impacted in the global South, it's islands. And when we think about, kind of the idea of greenwashing, oftentimes there is that plays quite prominently in actions toward the global South. Laetitia, I'd love to get your perspective on both of those issues.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the greenwashing, and we see this greenwashing also working with our partner in the global South, and especially those countries that are so dependent on imported fuel, where those big companies can come and say, well, your system, energy system is mostly based on diesel generator. Let's go to LNG, and that's progress, and that's development. And instead of having options to, as I was mentioning before, leapfrog to a renewable energy future, these solutions, the bridging solution, the transition solution through fossil fuels are still being sold to the global South, as if there was no other options, as if it doesn't make sense, it's not very economically viable to go straight to the renewable energy solution. So we have also to raise awareness amongst the decision makers in the global South, especially those, as I said, those countries that are highly dependent on imports from fuel and those are very outdated energy systems. And RMI is working with those decision makers in the energy sectors and and also even utilities through a very recent program that is being currently implemented, which is the Energy Transition Academy. And the Energy Transition Academy will provide the right information for those decision makers to really plan long-term, to build the workforce and the skills that are necessary in the countries, the supply chain, and all the components that are needed. And it's very complementary to what CFAN, the Climate Finance Access Network, is doing with the small island developing states. We are helping to access climate finance by providing financial support, financial skills, and to structure investment and develop projects that are not only bankable, but are also ambitious, that are bold, and that are also at scale. And therefore, I believe that RMI is providing to the Global South what we used to talk about technical assistance, but within the Global South, we call it enabling assistance, because it's really providing the tools. It's empowering decision makers, practitioners, stakeholders in the developing countries and the most vulnerable to make the decision that aligns with their priorities and they can fully own.
Yeah, and it's so important, that element of empowering, right? It's about helping and providing tools, but ultimately empowering these individual countries and communities to make the transition in the way that meets their needs and objectives. Questions are continuing to come in, and thank you. Keep them flowing here. One that was recently in the news, Cate, is around RMI's work with Exxon, right? And some consternation of, why is RMI working with Exxon at this current moment? Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So at the foundation of what RMI does is partnering with companies, organizations, institutions that can make an impact. Exxon, even though it doesn't have the best record on many things, is an organization that supplies a lot of fuel around the world. And so we have an opportunity in RMI to partner with Exxon to move forward the piloting of our MIQ standard, so that we can demonstrate the possibility of producing differentiated gas that has lower methane emissions on a large scale. So related to what Laetitia was saying about LNG being a liquefied natural gas being something that a lot of developing countries really have their eyes on right now to displace coal, to displace other polluting forms of power like diesel generators, that is scary to think that, okay, if we ramp down our consumption of natural gas in the US, it's just going to go somewhere else and it's going to be used. It is less scary in the near term if we have some assurance that that gas is being produced in a more responsible way. So while RMI programs are investing in ensuring that distributed renewables are growing around the world, that industry is taking advantage of renewable power in the deepest way possible, we also must partner with actors like Exxon to move the system from where it is to where it needs to be if it wants to play any part in our energy future.
Can I just chime in there, John, as well, to say, like, this speaks directly to the outcomes versus motives logic, right? Like, methane is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time frame. I think Amory has talked about how ignoring that problem or failing to act really, really radically fast on that problem is like ignoring arterial bleeding in a patient that's suffering from a chronic disease, right? And sometimes to stop arterial bleeding, you need to do uncomfortable things like engage with Exxon. And yeah, I think it's a classic example of us putting our money, so to speak, where our mouth is with respect to the primacy of outcomes over motives.
Yeah, and we've been very clear with Exxon and the entire global gas industry that first we're going to stop you from leaking gas, right? And then we're going to stop you from selling it. But they need, you know, kind of this support in the transition, and creating these differentiated products that have embedded within them a signal to the market on the carbon intensity is absolutely critical here going forward. You know, related to that, there's a question here on from a global South perspective as we think about new gas infrastructure. How do we prevent that from moving forward, and what can be done to help unlock opportunities for new distributed renewables as opposed to, you know, building the pipelines that are going to addict, developing economies to additional fossil fuels. Laetitia, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think twofold. First, usually when, in particular for vulnerable countries, I think what comes with those gas projects is a lot of pressure from countries and companies that still have a lot of influence on those really critical decisions that are being made for the countries. And I think we see some changes here. For example, in the Caribbean, there are several projects, LNG projects, that are being discussed in several islands, which is extremely frustrating because those countries would be committing themselves to those extremely expensive infrastructure that will become stranded assets very, very quickly and have a lifespan of 30 or 40 years. So it's extremely frustrating that at the moment, those countries don't have the capacity to counter this kind of pressure and demonstrate and make the business case for renewable energies in the countries, and not only at the country level, but at the regional level. And I think RMI is doing a lot of work in the Caribbean, of course, to develop those energy scenarios and show that there's not just one way of looking at the energy future of a country. And also, I think one of the most useful things I've seen working with RMI, I take the example of the Caribbean, is how to aggregate those energy projects, renewable energy projects across the region to be at scale, to meet the requirements of the international funds, to involve several stakeholders, using blended finance to make those projects viable and to cover the upfront cost of developing those bold projects. So working on both sides, I think RMI does a lot of work within the US, and in particular to change the rules of exporting technologies towards the global south. And we have seen some good movement there, and working with the recipient governments to offer them the alternative when their decision makers have to make those tough decisions that are for the next 30 or 40 years.
Terrific. Thanks, Laetitia. I'm going to have one final question here for you, Cate, and it's about balancing the long-term investment commitments of an industry with the short-term need for action in the next 5 years. A question around how do you think about that from an industry perspective and getting that initial momentum while restructuring the industry in the long term?
So you have to do both, of course, is the answer. We have an opportunity in this decade to set the path for how industry transforms from now through 2050. So we have to do big, bold, audacious things now to enable that transformation to happen. So RMI is in it for the long game, for sure, but we will always hold that message of 1.5 degrees as our North Star, as a way to activate people to understand the importance of near-term drastic action. So when we engage with companies through the Mission Possible partnership, we are setting out for them, in partnership with them, ambitious roadmaps and blueprints for action on what needs to be true in your industry for you to decarbonize by 2050. And we are holding them to commitments tied to these roadmaps. And we are going to hold them to the data that is needed to demonstrate they are making progress. So this is a long game. This problem has been a long time in the making. It's going to take a long time to solve. But what our job right now to do is to inspire swift, immediate, and bold action so we can set the trajectory that we really need moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Cate. Swift, immediate, and bold action is what we're all craving right now in response to this crisis. Thank you, Rushad, Cate, and Laetitia for participating today. Thank you all for joining us here. We're especially grateful for your time and support. And please do reach out to us directly where you see opportunities to help move the planet more swiftly to a 1.5 degree aligned pathway. We're keen to use our distinctive skills and capabilities where we can to get us to that end, because the alternative just doesn't work. Great. With that, over to you, Audrey.
Great. And let me also thank you, John, again for facilitating a wonderful, lively discussion today. We really appreciate it. You will see on your screen, there are a couple of other Climate Week related events that RMI is participating in. You can also visit rmi.org/events for a list of those events. They are open to the public. So please, if you have the time and interest, we encourage you to attend those. And finally, as always, a sincere gratitude for our supporters that have joined us today and for others that took the time to get to know RMI a little bit better today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all. Good afternoon, everyone.